In my Mother series retrospective, I reflected on my videos being constant retreats into the past. While it is unquestionably true that I do this as a means to escape, I also feel like I've learned a lot about my present self in doing so, and that dichotomy has made it feel natural to write about the things I find nostalgic. I escape for many reasons, of course, but when it comes to games specifically, I find that discussion of modern gaming for many reasons is a bit miserable. And for this video, I am going to use a couple of those reasons to reinforce why the console I'm talking about today was so awesome. The late 90s and early 2000s were a pioneering era for games as an art form. I've explored this extensively on my channel. Several key games from this era would shape the medium into what it is today. And I mean this in both an artistic sense and, unfortunately, an economic sense too. While games have certainly been able to legitimize themselves as an avenue for artistic expression over the past 20-odd years, simultaneously a more concerning change has taken hold of the industry. Ever-increasing budgets are being allocated to huge games that are designed to appeal to as many people as possible. Games that are designed to make back the exorbitant amount spent on developing them. These could absolutely be great games in their own right, too, and oftentimes they are. I've talked about a few on this channel that warrant their large scope and design. However, massive games have dominated at the expense of variety and experimentation. After enabling developers to blaze new paths in game design, companies saw the potential for profit and ran with it. At first, these massive games coexisted with other smaller games, as well as games that were decidedly different, but the AAA space has since shrunken to primarily accommodate a lot of what publishers can always count on to succeed. With the high budgets they have incurred through the rising costs to develop these games, it has led to devastating consequences when they are unable to make back the amount spent on developing them. Sony shuttered their own Japan studio, who not only delivered on smaller and exceptionally creative games from the PS1 era all the way to the PS5, but also served as a support studio for several of Sony's most revered games, including Bloodborne. They've also decided to completely eliminate the potential for reselling a game you definitively own by 2028, instead controlling the sales of all of their games through purchases of digital licenses that can be revoked at any point. For Microsoft, the diminishing returns meant laying off thousands upon thousands of employees at studios they'd bought. Deals that totaled in the billions, mind you, all because the games they made did not live up to Microsoft's insurmountable financial expectations. Therefore, when an original AAA passion project does well, I feel such an overwhelming sense of hope and relief for the future of the industry. Aside from a few fringe cases and some companies like Nintendo, who fund and release smaller games with a niche appeal, the more experimental games that used to share the AAA space are now largely left to independent developers to create, and that is where I think you'll find the most innovation in game design today, because they don't have to worry about making back hundreds of millions of dollars. They demonstrate that no matter if the game is developed on a shoestring budget or by a single person, they can leave an indelible impact in their own right, sometimes an impact arguably far greater than most AAA games have left in the past decade. The spirit of indie games today takes me back to when developers and publishers were willing to take chances in the name of reaching people that value great art. I've already talked about what systems like the PS2 and Dreamcast did for games in this context, but perhaps an even better example of creative games on a small scale leaving a deep impact can be found in the many games developed for the little handheld that went a long way: the Game Boy Advance. On its own, the Game Boy Advance is a system unencumbered by gimmicks. The system might not look like much today, but it enabled boundless creativity, and that's really what I want to convey most of all in the face of the industry today. The hardware was simply in the right place at the right time for many different kinds of games to exist on it. Its library is vast and its variety is strong. Everything from action to adventure to RPGs to racing to strategy and beyond. Most importantly, however, the Game Boy Advance proves that no matter the hardware, scope, or budget of a game, you can execute your vision for a game and give players a chance to create memories that will last a lifetime. The Game Boy Advance is a prime example of why I tend to write about the past, to learn from it, and to hopefully inform the future. Both my own future and the future of games as we know them. I'm Liam Triforce, and this is a Game Boy Advance retrospective. The Game Boy Advance came about following Nintendo's utter domination over the handheld market in the 1990s. When the original Game Boy first released in 1989, it featured a monochrome screen that lacked a backlight, while its competitors, the Atari Lynx, which launched the same year, and the Sega Game Gear, which launched a year later, both featured full-color, backlit screens. Despite this discrepancy, the Game Boy trounced both systems for a handful of reasons. First of all, as is tradition with Nintendo hardware, several incredible and groundbreaking games were released for the Game Boy. Link's Awakening alone made the purchase worth it, but it also had the Super Mario Land series, which eventually spun off into Wario Land, Tetris, which was bundled with the Game Boy at launch, Donkey Kong 94, which subverted expectations of it being a straight adaptation of the arcade game, and became one of the finest platformers on the Game Boy, and of course, Pokémon, which single-handedly renewed interest in the Game Boy very late in its life. There were many, many other games, of course, but those are some examples. That being said, the Game Gear had a handful of great original titles too, like Land of Illusion, the handheld Sonic games, and Shining Force Gaiden, though Gaiden was eventually remade for the Sega CD. And its library having so many Master System ports definitely gave it a leg up over the Atari Lynx. The Lynx had a few good ports, like Stun Runner, and the puzzle game Chips Challenge was originally developed and released as a Lynx exclusive, but it wasn't anywhere near the system seller that Tetris proved to be. In the end, the Game Boy was home to just over 1,000 games worldwide. The Game Gear had 365 games, while the Atari Lynx had just 71. Secondly, the Game Gear and Atari Lynx may have had full-color screens with a backlight, but this also resulted in them having poor battery life. The Game Gear took 6 AA batteries, and that gluttonous machine could drain them in 3 to 5 hours. The Lynx's battery life was a similar story. The Game Boy, however, took 4 AA batteries and could last up to 30 hours. That gray brick could just keep on trucking. Thirdly, and speaking of which, the Game Boy was actually truly portable. It was small enough to fit in your pocket and comfortable to hold wherever you were. The Game Gear was bloated by comparison, and both models of the Atari Lynx were even larger. Finally, the Game Boy was the cheapest out of the three systems, retailing for 12,500 yen in Japan and $89.99 in North America at launch, and it launched first. The Game Gear went for 19,800 yen in Japan and $149.99 in North America, while the Lynx went for $179.99. We never see prices like this anymore, by the way, even after inflation. Gaming is a luxury now. Nintendo eventually released Game Boy models that improved on its display, such as the Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Light, the latter of which actually featured a toggleable backlight. Even with a hit to battery life, these models accompanied the rejuvenating release of Pokémon Red and Blue, though sadly the Game Boy Light was only released in Japan. I mean, you could always use the Newbie Light, or the Booster Boy. The Game Boy was succeeded by the Game Boy Color in 1998. It had a short lifespan, and several Game Boy Color games were actually designed to be forward-compatible with the original Game Boy, as indicated by the shape of the cartridges. If they had these notches on the top, then they were only playable on the Game Boy Color and took advantage of its increased processing power. But if it maintained the design of an original Game Boy cartridge, it was fair game, including Pokemon Gold and Silver, which is insane. The Game Boy had an exceptionally long lifespan thanks to Nintendo's deliberate and constant support for it, and it would only be discontinued along with the Game Boy Color on March 31st, 2003, marking one of the longest lifespans for any game console, and combined sales with the Game Boy Color made it the best-selling video game system of all time upon its discontinuation. While the Game Boy Color was more of a side grade to the original Game Boy, its short lifespan was home to several phenomenal games, like the Zelda Oracle games, Pokemon Crystal, Shantae, fantastic ports of the first 3 Dragon Quest games, and the Wario Land games. It honestly could make for a great retrospective on its own, entirely separate from the Game Boy, but that's a story for another day. The Game Boy Color was developed specifically to counter renewed competition, not from Sega or Atari, but from SNK and Bandai, with the Neo Geo Pocket and WonderSwan respectively. It staved off the competition, to be sure, once again thanks to Nintendo's strong lineup of games, but it wouldn't last forever. Not to mention, it had been over a decade of the same hardware. The world was long overdue for something new. Something that made use of 10 years worth of technological advancements to enable novel and memorable experiences. At some point in the 90s, a team led by Satoru Okada developed a prototype for a proper successor to the Game Boy, dubbed Project Atlantis. Okada was involved with the development of every dedicated Nintendo handheld, from the original Game Boy all the way up to the Nintendo DS. It would use the same 32-bit processor that the Game Boy Advance eventually ended up with, but due to the humongous size of the console and the total price of manufacturing it, the team were not satisfied with their results and nothing came of it. The color screen of Project Atlantis would eventually be paired with a souped-up version of the Game Boy's processor, thus giving us the Game Boy Color. While this would buy time from a business standpoint, it was meant to be more of a transitional piece of hardware as the Game Boy Advance entered development, kind of like the DSi to the 3DS. When the Game Boy Advance finally released in 2001 with a launch price of $100, it quickly came to decimate the WonderSwan and Neo Geo Pocket, and it even outpaced the PlayStation 2 at one point. The Game Boy Advance sold 500,000 units within its first week on the market in North America, with Nintendo having to swiftly keep up with consumer demand week by week. In the UK, the Game Boy Advance sold 81,000 units in its first week, beating the PlayStation 2's 20,000 unit record. In fairness, the PlayStation 2's launch faced numerous issues that I outlined in my retrospective, but for a portable console, it was an overwhelming success. Before we dive into just how this happened and how Nintendo was able to maintain the Game Boy Advance's reign, we should talk about the console itself inside and out. The Game Boy Advance, in essence, is like having a portable Super Nintendo. So much so, in fact, that full conversions of A Link to the Past, Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, Final Fantasy, and the Mother series were created for it, a testament to its technical capabilities. Some of these ports had weaknesses, such as their color palettes and audio, but the former was actually not the fault of the internal hardware. The GBA could display exactly as many colors as the Super Nintendo. Instead, I suspect they were a stylistic choice due to the fact that most Game Boy Advance screens lacked a front or backlight, and the colors were presumably chosen to make the game easier to see. In reality, the GBA had a faster CPU than the Super Nintendo, clocking in at 16 MHz compared to the Super Nintendo's 3.58 MHz. It also has more memory than the Super Nintendo. The GBA's true weakness from a technical standpoint is in its audio. The Super Nintendo had a dedicated audio chip independent from the rest of the system, and its rich 16-bit sampling capabilities led to phenomenal audio across the board. The Game Boy Advance does not have a dedicated sound chip, instead it pairs the existing audio channels from the original Game Boy hardware with dual 8-bit digital to analog converters, which are used to play back samples. These samples are handled entirely by the system's CPU, which is why, depending on the game, these samples can either sound really good or really bad. Ultimately, a lot of music and sound effects were marred by white noise and just didn't quite sound as crisp as they otherwise could have. It was one of the biggest sacrifices Nintendo made with the GBA hardware. The good news is that many composers and sound engineers learned to design sound around this limitation. Take a listen to the music in Mega Man Battle Network 3. A lot of this game's soundtrack is actually led by the legacy Game Boy channels, but when it comes to the internet theme specifically, I think what completes this composition most of all is the synth sample in the background that makes you feel like you're floating in cyberspace, which is an inspired choice that takes the hardware into consideration, a sample that complements the tried and true Game Boy audio channels. The Sonic Advance trilogy also aimed to strike a balance between those legacy channels and samples. While other games just charged forward with reckless abandon, hoping that the compositions would overpower the system's weak sampling, to varying results. Aria of Sorrow pulled through in that regard. While the GBA remake of Super Mario World made the final world sound lactose intolerant. Anyway, the GBA is also similar to the Super Nintendo in that it can often employ its own groundbreaking effects. The staples of the Super Nintendo are still possible here, such as Mode 7, seen in various racing games for the platform, like way too many to talk about here. And even 3D effects similar to what the Super FX chip enabled were attempted, sometimes far surpassing the Super Nintendo's capabilities. Iridion 3D, a launch title, used impressive sprite scaling to simulate true 3D, and it looks unreal on a Game Boy Advance screen. Additionally, take a look at Star X, the closest we ever got to receiving a Star Fox game on GBA. All of its effects are on par with what Star Fox did in 1993, except you get to hold the entire console in your hands. It kind of makes you wonder why Nintendo never attempted a Star Fox game for the console. Another admirable attempt at 3D can be seen in Super Monkey Ball Jr. Thanks to the simplicity of the GameCube game's textures and geometry, the game retains the level design and gameplay from the first two games in the series. Yes, playing Monkey Ball on a D-pad is incredibly cursed, but I am astounded by just how well this conversion turned out in spite of that. Indeed, the Game Boy Advance went far beyond what anyone thought was possible. While researching for this video, I discovered the GBA version of Need for Speed Underground and a few other fully 3D racing games, while Asterix and Obelix was, to my knowledge, the console's only proper attempt at a full 3D action-adventure game. The environments use three-dimensional geometry, while the characters are pre-rendered sprites, but they are animated with squash and stretch in such liveliness that you'd be forgiven for thinking they were actual models on a GBA screen. Speaking of pre-rendered sprites, here's a game that I happened to own as a kid. Tekken Advance. Yes, a Tekken game with a controller interface like this does sound hilarious, but I like Virtua Fighter, and that game is just punch, kick, and guard, so I didn't care back then. Frankly, it's playable, but that's not why I bring it up. I bring it up because, well, it's Tekken on a Game Boy Advance, and that's astounding. Basically, the stage rotates against a static backdrop, while the characters are pre-rendered sprites. I mentioned this briefly in my Mario Kart video, but a lot of the illusion of pre-rendered 3D models is lost on modern displays because on a CRT, the characters of, say, Mario Kart 64, for example, look less jagged and more like actual models, thanks to how color CRTs display images. Tekken Advance uses this pre-rendering technique to great effect. I've recorded most of my footage with area scaling off of my modded Nintendo DS, which is pretty much identical to what it'll look like on most emulators today, too. This is not how it was meant to be seen, however. Of course the footage is going to look rough being blown up like this. On a small LCD screen, however, it looks just as though you put a PS1 game on the Game Boy Advance. The GBA screen on its own sells a lot of the illusions crafted for the system. As for compressed images and FMV, these shots of Lord of the Rings and Dragon Ball characters have visible, we'll say, imperfections on modern displays, but on a screen like the backlit LCD Game Boy Advance SP screen, it really isn't half bad. Both of these games predate the system's actual home video format, Game Boy Advance Video, by a good bit. Game Boy Advance Video was a format where I felt your mileage would vary, and it is mostly a product of its time. To be fair though, most 11-minute cartoons like SpongeBob looked and sounded fine enough for me to not really care back in the day. A 90-minute film like Shrek, on the other hand, was definitely compromised when it was released on GBA Video. I would not watch the whole film like this. I think even kid me would find its choppy frame rate off-putting. Eventually, portable DVD players became more affordable and logical choices, iPods started supporting video after a while, and now, thanks to streaming, you can watch anything on your smartphone, which only makes Game Boy Advance Video seem like a relic of an ancient age now. It is a testament to just how malleable this system was, though. Other times, converting a console game for the Game Boy Advance wasn't about pushing the technical boundaries of the console, It was about finding an intelligent way to adapt its gameplay and key features. This brings us to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, developed by Vicarious Visions. Today you probably know them best for the Insane trilogy and Pro Skater 1+2, and I have no doubt that their skill in developing conversions for the Game Boy Advance eventually led to their phenomenal work on those remakes. This was a late version of Pro Skater 2 released just a few months before Pro Skater 3 was set to be released on PS2, and it was a launch title for the Game Boy Advance. When conceiving their first game for the system, they deliberately chose to avoid what everyone else was doing, like SNES ports and Mode 7 racing games. They decided to pitch a Game Boy Advance version of Pro Skater 2 to both Activision and Tony Hawk while at E3 2000. This version was presented from an isometric perspective, which allows most of the levels to be easily visible, and they learned a lot about the hardware along the way. For one thing, it was technically infeasible to animate all of the tricks in the game through sprites, and instead chose to use 3D models instead. That is why the characters look like mangled dolls up close, but from an isometric perspective on a small GBA screen, the illusion works and you can't really tell. All of this level geometry is handled through math, using a height map to create 3-dimensional depth and stages, and the game utilizes Neversoft's original source code to make the physics feel as close to the home console versions as possible. Though this almost didn't happen. THPS 2 was written in C++, and Vicarious Visions planned to reuse as much of that code as possible in the GBA port, but Nintendo stated in the official documentation for their development kits that everything had to be written in C. Programmer Matt Conte had to take it upon himself to create a proof of concept to convince Nintendo that it was possible to run C++ on the GBA, otherwise he'd have to convert everything over himself. And he succeeded in convincing them, which was a significant breakthrough in creating games for the console, and it ensured that development would continue smoothly. The end result was a handheld conversion of Pro Skater 2 that was met with almost universal acclaim, not just for its technical breakthroughs, but for just how beautifully it transitioned the home console gameplay of THPS 2 to a handheld. The isometric perspective does take some getting used to, but once I adjusted, I found it to be overwhelmingly close to the original game and feel. Certain levels were altered or cut, and one of the levels is from the first game, but key features of all of these levels are retained. Hangar is almost identical to its home console counterpart. It's awesome, and I was almost afraid to play it because I grew up with the Game Boy Color version of the original Pro Skater, and it was awful. I'm glad I played this one though, I can't wait to go through the others. Vicarious Visions would go on to develop versions of every single Tony Hawk game for the Game Boy Advance up to American Wasteland, or American Skateland. And their technical know-how led to them becoming underrated legends of the Game Boy Advance. With the engine they'd developed for Tony Hawk, they released a conversion of Jet Set Radio in 2003. I don't know how this game came to be, but it plays exactly as you'd expect. From high profile to licensed cash grabs, they handled a lot of their handheld conversions with the same amount of care. Finding Nemo, for example, kept a lot of the console version's gameplay features and animations, right down to the 3-dimensional chase sequences. They absolutely did not have to get as close as they did to the Finding Nemo game of all things, but hey, the film is excellent, so I respect it. Vicarious Visions' history with Crash Bandicoot, as I alluded to earlier, also started here with Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure, or in Europe, Crash Bandicoot Xylophone Saxophone. It is structured identically to a PS1 Crash game, complete with platforming, box breaking, Wumpa collecting, crystals, gems, and relics, except it is almost exclusively presented in 2D, save for a few pace-breaking segments just as the PS1 games used. It is more of a greatest hits album by design, playing it pretty safe, but that was more than enough to satisfy me before the era of the Nintendo Switch and Steam Deck. Crash Nitro Kart also translates the gameplay of the main game swimmingly, despite the fact that it could not feature the anti-gravity mechanic of the home console version, which is a shame because the track design is easily the best thing about Nitro Kart, and the fact that it has some slowdown issues. Its translation of CTR's drift boosts and the typical adventure mode structure to a Mode 7 GBA racing game make it an awesome package. Anyway, one last showcase of the hardware defying all expectations with one of the few M-rated games for the system, Max Payne. When I saw that this game had a Game Boy Advance version, I had no idea what to expect. I guess I thought it would be a side-scrolling action game, as a lot of Game Boy Advance conversions took the easy route in that regard. In disbelief, the first thing I heard when the game booted up was James McCaffrey's narration as Max Payne.
Life was good. Sun setting on a sweet summer's day, smell of freshly mowed lawns, sounds of children playing, a house across the river on the Jersey side, beautiful wife and a baby girl. The American dream come true. Honey, I'm home. But dreams have a nasty habit of going bad when you're not looking.
Full voice acting was seldom attempted on the Game Boy Advance because of the CPU having to handle all audio, and because of the sheer amount of data it would take. THPS 2 didn't feature the licensed music for that reason. However, for Max Payne, voice acting was a necessity for the story to be told well, and Mobius Entertainment, now Rockstar Leeds, understood this. As a result, the comic panels and voices are almost entirely intact, albeit a little crunchy. As for the game, it is presented from an isometric perspective just like Tony Hawk, and while aiming takes some getting used to thanks to the D-pad being a massive downgrade from a mouse, the game corrects your shots for you well enough to the point where bullet time feels surprisingly accurate to the main game. The game isn't easy either. Bullets hit hard and I was constantly scavenging for painkillers. It all coalesced into something strongly reminiscent of just how compelling the main game was, and I had a hard time putting it down, despite the fact that I've played Max Payne plenty of times over on PC. To tell you the truth, I'm stunned. If you ever wanted to play Max Payne on the go, or if this was your first exposure to Max's story, frankly, this would have been an excellent option. Between this and Tony Hawk, it just goes to show that it isn't just about pushing the hardware to its limits in a nebulous way, it's about finding unique ways to utilize the hardware in service of the game you're trying to make. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. There were quite a few examples I could have used for this segment. Grand Theft Auto Advance, for example, used the framework of the 2D GTA games, but it was structured like the PS2 games, complete with safe houses and vehicle-based vigilante missions, and it was released on the same day as San Andreas. Despite the control scheme for Street Fighter Alpha 3 being awkward on a GBA to say the least, this port, developed by Crawfish Interactive, looks and plays 1,000 times better than you would have ever expected it to. The games I've chosen to focus on illustrate not only what the Game Boy Advance was capable of, but also how its capabilities and restrictions enabled creative solutions, as well as all different kinds of games. And yes, the GBA can run Doom. And Doom 2. All of this being said, the one thing the Game Boy Advance consistently excelled at was sprite-based games. The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap had especially detailed sprite work across the board, and depth in its layers and sprite scaling, creating a vividly realized fantastical world where differing perspectives and sizes are essential to gameplay. This is the essence of how Hidemaru Fujibayashi directs Zelda games, and why I love Minish Cap so much. He evaluates what is possible with the hardware, and comes up with something that would be fun to play around with in the context of Zelda. In the Minish Cap, this meant shrinking down to see the world in a new way, both in narrative and problem-solving contexts. In Skyward Sword, this meant the Wii Remote would be an extension of your character in all facets. In Breath of the Wild, the specifications of the hardware meant they could create a huge world, but meaningful interactions within that world were driven by the chemistry between its elements, and that made Breath of the Wild such a fascinating and detailed game. It didn't matter what was going on under the hood, so long as it enabled an effective core concept. I'd say more about the Minish Cap, but I've already talked about every Zelda game at length if you'd like to hear more. Another example of excellent sprite work can be found in Magical Vacation. This was a Japan-exclusive RPG from a studio called Brownie Brown, who later went on to develop a certain other RPG for the GBA. The game is okay. I like the setting being a magic academy and watching these characters come together after chaos kickstarts the story, and the battle system, while complicated thanks to type differences in classes, is still pretty cool. The artwork in this game is what floored me most of all, though. All of the natural areas are lush and vivid, and although they still look great blown up to this size, they look unbelievable on a GBA screen. It feels like there's always a new shot in this game that manages to blow my mind, like the driving sequence or the moonlight shimmering on the water. And this was in 2001, the same year the GBA launched. I almost wanted to keep playing if only to see what the team was able to pull off on this thing. Finally, yet another treasure from Treasure. Gunstar Superheroes combines pretty much every sprite-based technique I've seen on the GBA and beyond into one action game, and an awesome one at that. As was the case with the original Gunstar Heroes, it combines intense action and level variety with some mind-blowing visuals, and no two levels ever feel alike. Parallax scrolling to simulate depth in multiple perspectives, sprite scaling, rotation. It is the perfect showcase for everything the GBA could do, and the games it enabled, all rolled into one package, and you can't go wrong with it. Anyways, there's still lots to talk about, so we should move on. The Game Boy Advance was also fully backwards compatible with the overwhelming majority of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, which allowed me, someone who did not own either of those systems, to experience the games I missed out on. This would be how I first played Link's Awakening and Pokemon Red, among others. The GBA uses a separate processor with a dynamic clock speed in order to run games for each system, and for some reason, you can stretch the image with the shoulder buttons. I guess you could do that if you're some kind of freak. In a departure from the vertical bricks that defined Game Boy systems for a decade, the original Game Boy Advance employed a landscape design as seen with the Neo Geo Pocket and WonderSwan, with the D-pad Start, Select, B, and A buttons placed to the sides of the screen, rather than underneath. It also adds two shoulder buttons, L and R, to the top of the console. It came in a few colors. I have the translucent Glacier model. Reminds me of the fantastic N64 colors. God, what a fun era for tech. These days, smartphones and other devices have a ubiquitous design for the sake of accessibility, which is definitely for the best, but I have a soft spot for when tech was less sleek and uniform, and more stylish and designed like it was meant to come out of science fiction. Anyway, I found the original Game Boy Advance model to have a squishy D-pad in contrast to the firm ones used in previous Game Boy models, and the Start and Select buttons being small and rubbery make them feel strange, but the rest of the buttons are fine, and actually holding the console and playing games on it feels perfect. Much like the Nintendo Switch, Steam Deck, PSP, and PS Vita, I find this landscape layout to be my preferred way to play games portably, and a significant improvement over the layout of the original Game Boy. I would say I prefer this model over the later SP models overall, but the original Game Boy Advance did have some glaring issues. Along with the aforementioned D-pad feel, the screen lacks a backlight. No front light either. You are simply at the mercy of whatever light exists around you. Gotta bust out that worm light. I'd love to install a backlit screen into an original GBA model someday though. In 2003, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance SP, which featured a clamshell design for even more convenient portability, a rechargeable internal battery instead of running off of two AA's, and much firmer and more satisfying buttons than the original model, especially when it comes to the D-pad, though I do prefer the larger shoulder buttons on the old console. The biggest difference, however, was that the SP actually had a backlight. On certain models. It depends on the model number. For example, AGS-001 SPs only had a front-lit screen, while AGS-101 SPs had a backlight. I had the Pearl Blue SP growing up. This was the first handheld system I ever owned, and it had a gorgeous backlit LCD screen that made every game I played on it look stunning. Despite its improvements, I find that today, the SP has its own caveats. Regrettably, I have large man hands, and I find that they cramp up when playing games on this thing for extended periods of time. I can deal with that though. What I find even stranger is that Nintendo removed the headphone jack from the SP, instead requiring players to buy an additional cable in order to connect their headphones. Basically, it's like what smartphones have done today. The positives outweigh the negatives with the SP though. The only Game Boy Advance model I don't own is the Game Boy Micro. Released in 2005, this compact model had the backlit screen universally, interchangeable faceplates, and it brought the headphone jack back. Despite these improvements, today it would only exacerbate my issues playing games on an SP. Due to its small size, it removed backwards compatibility with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, and even back then, its introductory price was $100, which was $20 more than an SP was retailing for, while the Nintendo DS, which was fully backwards compatible with Game Boy Advance games, was just $50 more. It was sandwiched between better options in my opinion. Ultimately, the Micro would be discontinued in 2008, while the SP would still be sold for a while longer. That being said, you didn't just have to play your games portably. In 2003, Nintendo released the Game Boy Player attachment for the GameCube, a peripheral similar to the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo. It does exactly what you'd expect it to. It plays Game Boy Advance games on your television through the GameCube, in addition to Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. You can change out the borders, adjust the size of the screen depending on what looks best on your display, mimic the GBA's ghosting effect through in-software motion blur, and there's a dedicated function for swapping cartridges without having to turn the GameCube off. Best of all, the Game Boy Player is region-free, meaning you can play Game Boy Advance cartridges from around the world, but also, the units can be attached to any GameCube regardless of region. You do need the disc to match your GameCube's region though. If you're not interested in modding any of your consoles, the Game Boy Player is still one of the best options for playing physical Game Boy games today. And with mods, you can go even farther with it, changing the internal resolution and messing with filters among other things. GameCube connectivity was heavily encouraged through the Game Boy Advance's life, but that's something I already went into in my GameCube retrospective. Certain games like Four Swords Adventures and Pac-Man Vs. were designed around that connectivity and potential for asymmetrical gameplay, while other games enabled additional features like in Sonic Adventure's case, where you could send your Chow to your Game Boy Advance and take care of them on the go, like the Dreamcast VMU, or the Wind Waker in which you could use the Tingle Tuner for cooperative gameplay, and in order to find additional treasure. Other times you could unlock bonuses in the games that you linked up. Trying different combinations today feels like treasure hunting. You just never know what you might be rewarded with. I don't know, man. You hardly see stupid stuff like this in the industry anymore, now that handheld and home console gaming has been consolidated into one thing. Then of course you could use a separate link cable just as the original Game Boy had to play multiplayer games. Trade Pokemon, race in Mario Kart, defeat Vaati and Four Swords. There weren't as many core multiplayer experiences on Game Boy Advance as there were on DS, due in large part to the latter's streamlined connectivity, but Four Swords in particular was especially replayable, with randomized dungeon layouts and varying puzzles and items on both repeat playthroughs, and depending on how many players you had. It is in Nintendo's nature to enable experimentation in game design through hardware and peripherals, and the Game Boy Advance had its share of experiments. WarioWare Twisted is controlled almost entirely with a gyroscope built into the cartridge, but honestly, I was surprised to discover that it might just be one of my favorite games in the series. It's astonishing just how many possibilities open up for minigame design when your primary method of interfacing with the game is tilting it left and right. Balancing, steering, tilting, shifting. I'm astonished. Replaying it for this video has only solidified my opinion of the game. The original WarioWare was also released on the Game Boy Advance, and it's a classic of course, but I think I prefer Twisted overall. If nothing else, both introduced the timeless, simple charm of Ko Takeuchi's art to the world. Before I ramble any further, I want to mention one more weird experimental GBA game, this time from Konami, Boktai. When I was in elementary school, I remember seeing this one kid sitting in the grass and playing on his GBA, and he had this weirdly shaped cartridge sticking out of it, much like WarioWare Twisted. I remember asking him what he was playing, and he responded, "It's a game you play in direct sunlight." For the next several minutes of that lunch recess, my eyes were glued to the screen of his Game Boy Advance. I had never heard of anything like Boktai, and I still haven't seen anything like it since. Boktai managed to thematically implement a reason to get people out in the sun with their video games. Basically, your weapons in the game run on sunlight as you are fighting vampires, and you can set an in-game clock to accurately predict when the sun would rise and set in your region. In order to keep your weapon adequately charged, you need to play the game under the sun, and the solar sensor inside of the cartridge would allow you to charge your weapon quickly. Aside from that, if you were playing at night or indoors, you'd have to rely on in-game items, which makes the game much more tense, and on top of that, it's a stealth game, even being produced by Hideo Kojima. So why wouldn't you want to sit in the sun the whole time? Well, on top of the health risks in doing that in real life, you can actually overcharge your weapons by absorbing too much sun, meaning that you'll have to find shade or run back indoors to continue playing. Basically, all of your dungeon crawling has to be planned around a schedule. I don't think we've ever seen a game quite like Boktai, not only for its unique hardware, but also because in execution, it thematically makes sense. and it makes for a completely distinct gameplay experience. With the Game Boy Advance, the hardware was just in the right place for these kinds of games to be made, much like the Super Nintendo. That's the thing. I don't just refer to it as a portable Super Nintendo for its technical prowess. The Super Nintendo was home to many groundbreaking, definitive games in their genre and series, along with countless other games that felt like passionate contributions to this medium we all love. And the Game Boy Advance is no different. In particular, its first year was enough to immediately signal that the system was worth having. The Game Boy Advance's first year on the market brought with it an avalanche of great games. Some of them kicked off series, others continued and adapted those series for the hardware, and a lot of them were completely original works that are still remembered fondly today. Speaking solely about the year 2001, there were so many games, and these games will allow me to bridge into other games that defined the console. The Game Boy Advance launched on March 21st, 2001 in Japan, June 11th, 2001 in North America, and June 22nd, 2001 in PAL regions. It had a stacked launch lineup to say the least. 25 games in Japan, 17 in North America, and 15 in Europe. A lot of games in 2001 foreshadowed what was to come for the Game Boy Advance, and I think you'll come to understand what I mean as I bridge into these games' successors. First of all, at launch there was a deliberate parallel between the Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance, in that Nintendo released both a Mario game and an F-Zero game at the system's launch. Super Mario Advance was a remake of Super Mario Bros. 2, the American one anyway, and it was developed after the success of Super Mario Bros. Deluxe on Game Boy Color, which contained ports of the original Super Mario Bros. And the Lost Levels. Super Mario Advance would be the first of 4 remakes in the Mario Advance lineup, the others being Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, and Mario 3. I loved the Advance remakes dearly growing up, primarily because they looked and played beautifully on a portable console, which alone made them feel like definitive versions of the games in question. I have gripes with elements of the Super Nintendo remakes in particular, especially the colors looking washed out for the sake of being more easily visible on a dark GBA screen, as well as the aforementioned audio being noticeably worse, but these are all incredible games, and the novelty of these lovingly crafted remakes being portable, to me, made owning the console seem immediately worthwhile. Obviously, the landscape for portable gaming has changed, thanks to the power of the Switch 2 and Steam Deck, and the originals in Super Mario All-Stars are now playable through Nintendo Classics just as Super Mario Advance is, but I still admire the care that went into this series. The original Super Mario Advance is perhaps the most transformative of the Advance remakes, encouraging players to obtain combos when throwing vegetables at enemies. Veggies can vary in size. The game has an equivalent to Yoshi coins from Mario World for obtaining extra lives. And there is a lot of voice acting. So much voice acting. They would tone things down a bit for the other Advance remakes. If nothing else, I played the Mario Bros. Arcade remake endlessly on long car rides when I was a kid, and it features in every single Mario Advance game as a bonus. If I had to choose a favorite, I'd want to say Advance 2, just because it was my first exposure to Super Mario World, and that remains my favorite 2D Mario game. But I'd have to give it to Advance 4 overall, because I love the look and feel of it the most, and it happens to be my favorite version of Mario 3. The point of all of this is that you could not go wrong with these games. Meanwhile, at launch, you could also pick up F-Zero Maximum Velocity. This game parallels the Super Nintendo F-Zero, not just in being paired with a Mario game at launch, but also in utilizing the original 3-boost mechanic from that game, rather than the gauge-dependent boost that you could hold the button to use in F-Zero X. If you wanted something more like that, you'd have to wait a couple of years, upon which we received F-Zero GP Legend and F-Zero Climax. In essence, these felt like the original F-Zero, but with the mechanics and game feel that F-Zero X and GX brought to the table. It was an immaculate fusion. GP Legend in particular, being based on the F-Zero anime adaptation, featured a rich and replayable story with different criteria for success and a multitude of different modes, while Climax had a full-on track editor, and you could generate passwords for sharing your tracks with friends. Sadly, Climax only released in Japan, but that's alright because the vast majority of the game is in English, and Game Boy Advance systems are not region-locked, so a Japanese game will work on a North American system, for example. Not only that, but it is also readily available today on the Nintendo Classics service. Castlevania was also present at the Game Boy Advance's launch. Previously, the series had a huge presence on Nintendo consoles, but Konami chose to develop the next 2D game after Rondo of Blood and Dracula X on PlayStation, reserving 2 3D entries for the Nintendo 64. Ultimately, Symphony of the Night ended up being the clear victor, and it, along with Super Metroid, would establish the genre we now know today as Metroidvania. Thankfully, successors to Symphony of the Night would appear primarily on Nintendo's handhelds, starting with the Game Boy Advance and Circle of the Moon at the system's launch. Complete with moody sprite work and a huge map, this game would prove that something of Symphony of the Night's scope was more or less possible on the Game Boy Advance. While Circle of the Moon is a great game in its own right, the dual setup system allowed you to mix and match power-ups to freely discover combinations you enjoy, and the map was fun to explore. I have the most fondness for the third GBA Castlevania game. Yes, there were 3 of them. After Circle of the Moon came Harmony of Dissonance, which featured the return of Ayami Kojima's gorgeous, gothic artwork, as well as the return of Symphony of the Night composer Michiru Yamane. 2 things that carried over into the third and final GBA Castlevania game, and my personal favorite, Aria of Sorrow. In Aria of Sorrow, it is the year 2035, and you play as perhaps the hottest Castlevania protagonist next to Alucard, Soma Cruz, who is studying abroad in Japan and finds himself inside Dracula's castle, which has been sealed inside of a solar eclipse. As ridiculous as this premise sounds, let's just say that Soma just might look pale and vampiric for a legitimate reason, and you'll have to play to find out. Aria of Sorrow employs the Tactical Soul system, in which you can absorb and equip enemy souls that come in 4 categories. Some act as this game's sub-weapons, some allow you to transform, some of them summon familiars, some of them are passive enhancements, and some of them grant you special abilities necessary for completing the game. It expands significantly on the dual setup system and spellbooks in Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance respectively, allowing far more player freedom and making your exploration of the castle consistently exciting. Not to mention, the design of the castle this time around is pretty much perfect. It manages to be simultaneously huge and compact without ever being overwhelming, and you can wrap back around to different areas in a variety of ways through connecting paths. It balances traversal in every direction without excessive backtracking, something that became an issue in both of the previous GBA games and Symphony of the Night. I honestly think you can make a solid argument for Aria of Sorrow being the best game in the series, and that is a huge testament to just how well the Game Boy Advance enabled games of this scope to be made without compromises. If nothing else, this game predicts that by 2035, men's fashion will never be the same. We'll be wearing fur-colored trench coats with a sexy black turtleneck underneath, and bell-bottom jeans with gold buttons. Bell-bottoms are already kind of making a comeback. Soma Cruz's influence is palpable. I wish I looked like him, dude. As you can see, several established franchises were able to make the leap to the Game Boy Advance in 2001, and succeed with flying colors to the point where, in the years that followed, multiple entries were developed to build on what they had learned. But what about game series that did not have an existing blueprint and began right here on the Game Boy Advance? While Mega Man Battle Network technically belongs to an existing series, its gameplay and setting are wholly unique and unlike anything I've played since. I grew up with the third game. It was actually the first GBA game I ever owned, so that's the footage you're seeing on screen here, but I have played the first game as well, and the first game was yet another launch title for the system. Reflecting on it now, the Battle Network series was a wonderful time capsule. The internet still had an atmosphere of intrigue to it in the 2000s, before everything became centralized on homogenous social networking, before massive companies began to control and police what could be seen, as if it were television, and before it was a constant, practically mandatory presence in all of our lives. It was just an escape. A means of unwinding after a long day at school or work, and a means of sharing your art and your passions with the world. It can still very much be that escape, of course, but it certainly isn't what it was when I was a kid. Building an RPG out of how the internet felt back then seemed like a fantastic idea, and Battle Network ran with that in every conceivable way. It imagined a world where we used digital avatars to meet up with friends, explore the internet, and battle viruses firsthand. Basically, it was as if the whole internet was like an MMO. I mean, I guess the internet kind of is an MMO now that I think about it, except instead of viruses, we're fighting each other on Twitter over some bullshit that doesn't matter. A typical battle in these games presents you with you and your enemy's positions on a 6x6 grid. Both of you get a 3x3 space to move around in. You can fire and charge your Mega Buster here and avoid attacks, but what you really want to be doing is utilizing your battle chips. When you start a battle, you'll be able to select multiple chips, so long as they belong to the same type or letter, or if they carry the wildcard designation. If you're not happy with the chips you've selected, you can spend a turn to add more chips from your library. You are rewarded for the speed of each battle with new chips, items, and money, which you can also find throughout the internet and from jacking into different things. And you can customize your library as you go through the game to create a loadout you're happy with, much like another GBA franchise entry we'll be talking about eventually. The game is a ton of fun to play inherently, but what I love specifically about it is how it adapts Mega Man staples into this fantastical depiction of the internet as a parallel world to our own, with details such as the nostalgic portable email era UI, complete with characters sending you email, the bizarre places that somehow have internet access, the firewalls and passwords to enter your friends' home pages. It's all so comforting to revisit these days, and even at the time, it explored that fascination I and many others held for the internet. The music example I played earlier, and the one that's playing underneath this segment, is a perfect encapsulation of that. Beyond launch day, the rest of the Game Boy Advance's first year brought a slew of heavy hitters. Around the holiday season, Sonic Advance was released in Japan. It coincided with the Japanese release of Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on GameCube, and came shortly after Sega declared defeat and withdrew from console development. I was too young to understand how big a deal that was at the time, but yeah, the Dreamcast's demise was swift, and massive change came just as fast. Sonic Advance was developed by former Neo Geo Pocket developers, including some that worked on Sonic Pocket Adventure, and they came together to form the company Dimps. This will not be the last Dimps game in this video, and I don't just mean in regards to Sonic. After this game, Dimps had a long-lasting relationship with Sega creating Sonic games, and from replaying Sonic Advance for this video, it's clear to see why. Like Crash Bandicoot, Sonic Advance is more of a greatest hits album than it is wholly original, but those hits remind me of why I love these games to begin with. The level design is a solid mixture of a rewarding sense of speed with careful platforming and exploration, except for the bottomless pits in the late game, and it controls beautifully, carrying over the momentum you could gain in the Genesis games. When Sonic Advance released, it was the first 2D Sonic game aside from Pocket Adventure since the mid-90s, when all attention had shifted toward 3D game development, which no doubt made it incredibly refreshing for this game to be a reintroduction to Sonic's classic gameplay. It's also refreshing to have a 2D Sonic game predominantly feature Yuji Uekawa's artwork, as nowadays, 2D Sonic seems to be exclusively classic Sonic's domain. I get that Sonic 4 didn't go over well, but there's nothing wrong with trying something different. You can play as Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles of course, but I found Amy Rose to be surprisingly fun in this game. At first she seems to be at a major disadvantage, trading the spin dash for a little leap forward, and not being able to roll into a ball at all, even while jumping. But the moment you begin to understand the power of her hammer, everything changes. It has a generous hitbox, and if you use it just as you're about to land on a spring, you'll rocket into the air and reach far greater heights than any of the other characters. It takes some time to master, but I honestly just consider this game Amy Advance now. She doesn't play like this in the other Advance games, sadly. Right, so Sonic Advance 2 and 3 experimented far more and are more divisive for that reason. It seems like everyone I've spoken to about Sonic Advance has a different favorite game in the trilogy, which I think is ideal, especially as a Zelda fan, since every game in that series is distinct. I really don't like the idea of designing something to appeal to as many people as possible, or creating the same thing every time. I would rather make something I'm interested in creating. Sonic Advance 2 went all in on enabling an exhilarating sense of speed, performing tricks to extend your hang time and reach new areas, and I find it enjoyable in a more mindless sense compared to the first game, but I also find that it trips over itself as you go along, because its idea of challenging your sense of speed is to place bottomless pits everywhere that you can't see until you're already falling, or they're just in really stupid places that betray the design of the level. This is unfortunately a common staple of the DIMP Sonic games. They're even present in the Rush games on DS. Accessing special stages in this game is also strangely obtuse, requiring you to collect 7 special rings in a stage, which means thoroughly exploring stages in a game designed to propel you forward. That being said, speedruns of this game are able to make this game look like one of the best games in the series, so my conclusion is that this game just isn't for me, because it looks like you can totally earn and maintain a sense of speed in all respects, and completely master levels, which is what Sonic is all about for me. Sonic Advance 2 was also the game to introduce cream and cheese to the franchise, and despite drawing ire from a lot of Western critics at the time of her inclusion in this game and Sonic Heroes for her voice design and naming scheme, I love Cream. She can fly, she can send cheese out to attack bosses and enemies, and she smiles and waves at you when she's on a rail. How can you hate this bundle of joy? It sounds like she's more popular in Japan at least. Sonic Advance 3 expands on the possibilities for level design and gameplay with the series' multiple playable characters by allowing you to create any combo you like. So long as you've unlocked the character, you can pair them up with any other character. Also, the lead character you choose will alter your abilities as well. To compensate, the levels can often be huge and encourage exploration for hidden, exclusive routes. My problem with the game is that I find it drags because of this focus, especially with the shift to 3 full acts per zone. It's excessive in my opinion, but this scope is a core part of the experience and an extension of the team-up mechanic, so I could see why this would be someone's favorite game in the trilogy. Again, I'll reiterate that all 3 of these games offer something completely different, and I admire that in spite of everything I've said. Sonic had a presence on Game Boy Advance outside of these games, but I don't enjoy those games anywhere near as much as Sonic Advance. Sorry, Sonic Battle. Now, despite what I've said about Sonic Advance and Super Mario Advance, these are not actually my favorite platformers on the GBA. In fact, I still can't really give an answer to that question. But if I had to pick now, I'd say Wario Land 4 is an exceptionally strong contender, also released in the GBA's first year on the market. If you still haven't played the Wario Land games, this series differed from Mario in that they prioritized exploration and gradually mapping out the level design as you go. In Wario Land 4, these level layouts can be sprawling and feature varying degrees of nonlinearity, and you'll need to find all of the gem pieces in each level to unlock each boss fight. Some of these gem pieces can only be found if you hit the switch at a certain point in the level, upon which you'll need to hurry up! You'll run back to the entrance portal in the allotted time. If not, you'll start bleeding coins, run out of coins, and you'll have to do the level over again. Thankfully, if that happens, you'll already have the prior knowledge of where the gem pieces are. This is where Wario Land 4's brilliant, dual-purpose design truly shines. On one hand, you're gradually memorizing the level as you use all of Wario's moves to smash through enemies and access new areas. On the other hand, once you're running back through the level and finding new routes, sometimes with the level design having been transformed by that press of a switch, you'll find yourself using all of Wario's moves with your knowledge of the level design to hop around at top speed. It is a gorgeous fusion, and the risk of losing everything is just high enough to be compelling without being frustrating. On top of that, look at this game! It is an absurdist, artful explosion of creativity and fun. A playable, psychedelic buffet of exceptionally weird and memorable ideas. These bosses look like cartoon nightmares come to life. Wario Land 4 isn't just one of the best games on the Game Boy Advance, it's one of the best platformers I've ever played, and a true testament to the games the GBA was home to. It's no wonder it created its own subgenre of platformers in its wake, like Anton Blast and Pizza Tower. I was also going to mention Klonoa Empire of Dreams here in regards to GBA platformers, as I loved it dearly growing up, but I'm going to save the rest of the Klonoa games, including the other Game Boy Advance ones, for a Klonoa retrospective I've been wanting to make for years. I hope I can end up getting around to it. In any case, this is what fundamentally impressed me about the Game Boy Advance. It managed to enable home console quality games consistently, sometimes even matching or surpassing them depending on the context. To that end, we should talk about an RPG that consistently felt not just like it could have been released on either the PlayStation or Sega Saturn, but also one that does enough to stand on its own. Golden Sun. Coming off of their work on the Shining Force series, Camelot developed Golden Sun to carry a lot of the DNA of their previous work, complete with the silent protagonist, the visual dialogue options, and the cute three-dimensional look to the in-game sprites that can also be observed in the Saturn Shining games. Though the game gets off to a slow start, the concepts it introduces in that time are compelling, such as the emotional genesis for Isaac's coming-of-age story, the puzzle-focused dungeon design, and the various Djinn you can collect, adding a sort of Final Fantasy V-esque job system layer to the turn-based combat. These three elements make Golden Sun powerfully enticing. Thanks to the various synergy spells you learn over the course of the game, dungeons in this game have Zelda-esque layouts and puzzles going for them, which is something I see very few RPGs attempt, due to the typical focus in RPG dungeons being on resource management across multiple random battles and bosses. But Golden Sun manages to pull it off not only thanks to its intelligent design, but also due to the slow passive regeneration of MP outside of battle. It's not too fast to the point of the game being too easy either. It's perfect. I've been playing Golden Sun on my own time gradually, and it has consistently impressed me in its ability to feel like a home console JRPG. Finally, longtime SRPG developer Intelligent Systems put out their first strategy game on the system in 2001, Advance Wars. Unlike their other series, Fire Emblem, Advance Wars is part of the larger Japanese Wars franchise first established on the Famicom, and it is a core strategy game with no RPG elements whatsoever. The decision to release Advance Wars in the West created a domino effect that eventually led to Fire Emblem becoming a flagship franchise for Nintendo. Basically, the team was told that turn-based games did not perform well outside of Japan, so Advance Wars was designed as an answer to that, with detailed tutorials for the sake of acclimating players to the wide assortment of units and options in this game. I am horrible at strategy games. I can play tactical RPGs fairly well, and I can play chess, but I am useless at anything else. Advance Wars is so thorough and helpful in its tutorials, and its design make the utility of each unit explicitly clear, while resource management is just a matter of capturing bases and sharing ammo and whatnot with other units when you can, because the game streamlines a lot of the economic elements you'd see in other strategy games. In the end, this game was released first in North America, and it was unanimously acclaimed. Tonally, it is odd to describe Advance Wars as charming, considering that each battle is a brutal, full-scale war, but the art, animation, and dialogue all earnestly sell that notion. Looking back, Intelligent Systems was definitely one of the MVPs of the Game Boy Advance. In addition to developing a main series Mario Kart game in the system's first year on the market, as well as 2 Advance Wars games, they also developed 3 Fire Emblem games and WarioWare Twisted. That's 7 games, and each of them have their own reason for existing. In addition to Advance Wars, and with how wildly distinct WarioWare Twisted is from the original, which I've discussed already, each Fire Emblem game has a distinct focus. I haven't played the Binding Blade yet, but the Blazing Blade, simply called Fire Emblem outside of Japan, acts as a prequel to that game and has multiple playable protagonists, Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector, all moving between battles at a brisk pace that suits the Game Boy Advance's portable nature. I've been playing a chapter of this game every night before bed while working on this video, and it's a comfortable game that still does not sacrifice Fire Emblem's typical storytelling prowess or tactical challenges. It is overly tutorialized in the beginning for the sake of its newfound Western player base, but since the rest of the game moves so quickly, I can forgive it. Also, we are lucky to have this game. We can thank Advance Wars and Roy's inclusion in Melee for that. Meanwhile, The Sacred Stones tells an original story and incorporates features from Fire Emblem Gaiden, such as an overworld map, and Genealogy of the Holy War, with the unit-based skills making a return, in addition to the branching class system introduced with this game. Each of these games were developed with a distinct focus. Blazing Blade builds on the world established in the previous game and reintroduces the series' gameplay wonderfully, while The Sacred Stones consolidates features from across the series into an original story. WarioWare Twisted took the notion of microgames conveying everything you'd need to know from the moment you'd see them for the first time, and intuitively understanding what you need to do within a fraction of a second, and gave you a vastly applicable method of interfacing with its lineup of microgames. And then, of course, Advance Wars managed to make strategy earnestly appealing to a useless player like me with its sense of originality and style. Additionally, out of the games I've mentioned since the beginning of this video, the ones you're seeing on screen right now were all released somewhere in the world in 2001. The Game Boy Advance's first year on the market. Crazy. A lot of games were released for the Game Boy Advance in its lifetime, and a lot of them were of high quality, and established a reason for existing. Could they have been developed for systems other than the Game Boy Advance? Certainly, with the exception of maybe Boktai and a few other fringe cases. But I don't think they would have existed had the Game Boy Advance not been an option. Precisely because games could be developed on a smaller scale, and therefore for less money, the games could see a bigger return on investment, because unfortunately that does matter. And most importantly to me, they were all an execution of a creative vision, and they all had something to say, and something to accomplish in this medium. To further illustrate what I mean by that, we should dive into some more games I feel like showcasing. Games that were possible because of the Game Boy Advance. Wrapping back around to Mega Man, another sub-series began in this massive franchise, except this one was actually a platformer, Mega Man Zero. I've only ever played the first game, but I adore Toru Nakayama's art for these games. The character designs having such big, shimmering eyes and being so cute just serves to accentuate the much darker tone. Much like Mega Man X came to exist thanks to the Super Nintendo, I feel the Game Boy Advance served as an alternative to the obsessive 3D gold rush that was happening around the time the game was released. And thus, Zero got his own game. If you're wondering why I only ever played the first game, it's because playing this game is like deliberately sticking a needle under your toenail and kicking a wall. It's brutal, and by playing it, I feel like I'm torturing myself. I'm already not great at Mega Man outside of the original Mega Man X, but Zero is especially disgusting with its difficulty. But one day, I'll finish it. On the easier side, a Game Boy Advance game I loved dearly was Mario vs. Donkey Kong. This was a spiritual successor to Donkey Kong 94 on the Game Boy. It would spawn its own sub-series that is too vast to discuss here, but it remains developer Nintendo Software Technologies' most successful project to date. And for good reason, it's a lot of fun. Speaking of Mario, after Super Mario RPG and Paper Mario, co-directors Chihiro Fujioka and Yoshihiko Maekawa joined Alpha Dream and co-directed the RPG Tomato Adventure together. This would serve as the precursor to the next Mario RPG, known outside of Japan as Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, with Maekawa directing. Much like the Mario RPGs that came before it, Superstar Saga played around with real-time elements during combat, made exploration and minigames a core part of the experience, and all of this, combined with its sense of humor, made the game worth playing through. Oh, and Yoko Shimomura returned to compose the music, and you can feel her impact in that soundtrack. Though Thousand Year Door is still probably my favorite of the Mario RPGs, I love Superstar Saga dearly, as it was the first RPG in the franchise I ever completed, and its variety, pacing, wonderful sense of style, and gameplay are all still profoundly enjoyable after all these years. Oh, and just a fun fact, Alpha Dream also developed Hamtaro Rainbow Rescue for the GBA, which was produced by Shigeru Miyamoto. The GBA Hamtaro games are a strange piece of history for Nintendo's involvement in their creation, and I used to rent Ham Ham Heartbreak from Blockbuster, but I had no idea Alpha Dream developed the second one until I was making this video. I figured a few people out there would be happy to hear me mention GBA Hamtaro, and I had no idea where else to put this in the video, so there you go. Anyway, there were so many RPGs on the Game Boy Advance. Turn-based, tactics, action, the system had everything. In fact, Tetsuya Nomura had the idea to direct a card-based Kingdom Hearts game that serves as an essential and fascinating piece of the story, and release it on the Game Boy Advance instead of the PS2. Creating an atmosphere of confusion when KH2's intro attempted to recap Chain of Memories. In all seriousness though, Chain of Memories is a great game. I never liked the PS2 remake of this one because they made you engage with the card system simultaneously with the existing Kingdom Hearts gameplay, meaning you're essentially playing two games at once. But seeing how the game was intended to be played on GBA made me realize just how cool the map system and card battles actually are. The card break mechanic can be annoying as all hell, but building a deck strategically feels like a more freeform version of the AP system in the main series games. I also enjoy collecting cards for the room synthesis. Though your routes through the game's worlds can be more linear than you'd think, using cards wisely is the best way to unravel these mazes quickly. Not to mention the core game feel is surprisingly close to the console games. Sora's basic air combo immediately gave me the impression that they did their homework here, as it feels just as weighty and satisfying. Also, the game has original FMV cutscenes, created with the PS2 game engine and pre-rendered specifically for this game. Once again, I'll reiterate that these videos are going to look crunchy when blown up like this, because on a small screen, they look kind of insane. But focusing solely on these in terms of presentation is doing a disservice to the game's sprite work and soundtrack, which are both top-notch. I'm still amazed by how much mileage developers were able to get out of the GBA. Of course, when it comes to RPGs, it would be vile of me to skip over Pokemon. I figure there's not much I need to say that hasn't already been said about Gen 3 and its remakes, and that's probably for the best because in all honesty, I've never finished Pokemon Emerald. All of my knowledge of this generation comes from the trading card game and the anime, which is why I've been able to shock so many people when I tell them I've never played the game these Pokemon originated from. I've played all of Pokemon Fire Red, but yeah, somehow I missed Emerald as a kid. A few years ago I beat the first 3 gym leaders and then I stopped playing for whatever reason. The Pokemon generation I spent the most time on by far is Gen 4, with Pokemon Diamond and Pokemon Soul Silver, and I talked a bit about that in my DS retrospective. What I will say is that this generation is fondly remembered for a reason, and my time with both the games and its accompanying media made that explicitly clear. That, and I played Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire for this video, and even though I am useless at pinball, I found collecting Pokemon in it to be an exciting prospect. It's the perfect game for a portable console. You make attempts at high scores and complete the Pokédex gradually with each run, and then you put the console back in your pocket and go about the rest of your day. If even I could see the appeal of that game when I suck at pinball, then it must be a good one. Without a doubt, though, one of the strongest arguments one could make for the Game Boy Advance, not only delivering on console-quality experiences, but also in enabling specific kinds of games thanks to the hardware being designed the way it is, and its games surpassing all expectations for a portable console in execution, is by showing someone Metroid Fusion. Once again, I already have a video on both this and Zero Mission, but Fusion in particular is a groundbreaking achievement in furthering the sense of tension and unease that Metroid can create, all thanks to the SAX. At its core, it is a fantastic 2D Metroid game that was made possible thanks to the Game Boy Advance existing at a time when 3D seemed like the primary thing to pour resources into. But what makes it especially unique is its suffocating yet purposefully linear structure, which was employed in order to create a deliberately terrifying experience for the player. You don't know when you'll receive your next items, and worse yet, the SAX will stalk you and try to kill you in scripted sequences that gradually bring you closer and closer to it, and you are told multiple times to just run if it sees you. Gradually breaking out of that rigid structure as the game progresses and the mystery unfolds is extremely compelling, and it makes for a Metroid experience unlike any other. I firmly believe it had a huge impact on several Metroid games moving forward, and how they lean into their horror roots, for the sake of gameplay and atmosphere. Of course, if you wanted something less linear and more open to experimentation and sequence breaking, Zero Mission was your game. It was an expansive reimagining of the original Metroid, refined thanks to everything that has come after it, and serves to establish more of Samus's origins. If Super Metroid wasn't so good at balancing atmosphere and open-ended gameplay, I'd say Zero Mission is my favorite game in the series. And the Game Boy Advance giving us the best of both worlds in regards to Metroid is reason enough to respect it. It perfectly complemented the GameCube in that it offered a reasonable, affordable alternative to those that weren't chomping at the bit over cutting-edge hardware. But as these two Metroid games demonstrated, simpler hardware and smaller scopes are never a reason not to give a project your all. Really, the Game Boy Advance library is so packed with great games that I could be here for hours, but in perhaps the strongest parallel to the PlayStation 2, I feel like everyone has that one game they obsessed over on the Game Boy Advance, thanks to its vast library that spans countless genres. Here are some games that I either discovered at various points in my life, or games I discovered while researching for this video, and felt they deserved a showcase. Incidentally, a lot of these games are licensed games, because this was an era where a lot of those games were being made, and I gobbled them up without knowing any better. The good news is that the Game Boy Advance generally has a higher batting average of good games, likely because 2D games are harder to royally screw up, and this has led to way too many games for me to record for this video. But hey, I guess that's a good problem to have, right? I once said that you could discover and play new games on the PS2 until the day you die. And while the GBA library is 10 times smaller than the PS2's, I still think you'll have your hands full with this system for a very, very long time, thanks to the quality and diversity of its library. Let's start with a game I'd been meaning to play for far too long, and finally played it in full for this video. Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku 2. First of all, why not talk about the first game? Well, I had played the first game already, and it's awful. 2 is a significant improvement in every way. I am a simple creature. If you put an action RPG in front of me and have me hit things to get stronger, and do quests where I hit stronger things, I will probably get way into it. They tickle my brain as I optimize my equipment and damage output and complete quests. Legacy of Goku 2 is very much like that, and it's awesome. The game covers the Android and Cell sagas in a cohesive manner, my personal favorite portion of Dragon Ball Z, with the tutorial even taking place in Trunks' timeline as he watches an adult Gohan be defeated. As you experience the storyline, you'll be exploring, hitting things using energy blasts and special moves, all while improving your stats through battle and completing quests for the sake of the major narrative battles. You'll gradually unlock more characters as the story progresses, like Piccolo, Vegeta, and Trunks, before finally being able to play as Goku, upon which the game truly opens up, as you search for the 7 Dragon Balls. One technique you'll absolutely have to master as you play through this game is being able to rhythmically hit enemies as you follow up on their knockback state. The idea is that you'll be stun-locking enemies with this technique. I really don't think the game was designed to be played like this, but otherwise enemies can easily get hits in. And it's fun, so who cares? Mastering this takes time, and it does kind of trivialize the difficulty when you do, but it's also not the only way to deal with them. You have charged attacks, your energy beams, of course, and you can use transformations to move much faster and hit harder at the expense of your energy meter, provided that you're leveling your characters sufficiently enough. It's worth noting that the Legacy of Goku trilogy was actually developed in America, contrary to most Dragon Ball games, and Legacy of Goku 2, to my knowledge, remains the only Western-developed Dragon Ball game to be released in Japan. As a byproduct of it being developed here, it actually arranges Bruce Faulconer's score for the series for the Game Boy Advance, which is an absolute delight to hear. Boo's Fury specifically adapts Gohan's anger for the forest surrounding Goku's house as you play as Gohan, and there's something so deeply nostalgic about hearing it play through the Game Boy Advance speakers. The final fight with Cell is awesome. You have to ensure that all of your characters are leveled up enough to scrape by against both Cell and the Cell Juniors he sends out, and by the time you survive long enough to see Gohan let his anger fly in the wake of Android 16's death, you'll be able to stay in Super Saiyan 2 forever and deal a ton of damage. Keep in mind, if you die at any point, you're going back to your last save. It feels like an incredible reward to have made it this far and be able to just style on Cell like this. Despite the game taking some liberties, I feel this is such a perfect emotional adaptation of how it felt watching Gohan fight Cell in an interactive context. If you're looking for a good action RPG and you like Dragon Ball, you can't go wrong with this one. The funny thing is, this isn't even my favorite Dragon Ball game on the system. That distinction belongs to Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure. This was a platforming beat-em-up hybrid game that mostly breezes through key moments in the original Dragon Ball, and it is a joy to play through. It was developed by Dimps, the same studio behind Sonic Advance, and the gameplay is easy to pick up, it has just the right amount of challenge, there's secrets to find, and I genuinely believe anyone can play this game and have a good time, regardless of whether or not they know anything about Dragon Ball. In fact, the game was marketed in North America with Goku's appearance in Z plastered on the box, just in case Westerners hadn't seen OG Dragon Ball, which to this day is still a lot of people. Toriyama's characters, storylines, and artwork shine through in their purest and simplest forms. The sprite work is consistently excellent, and the game is satisfying to play through. I took this game on a road trip with me when I was a teenager, and it quickly became one of many games I associate with the Game Boy Advance. These next two games are The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers and The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King. They are both Diablo-likes where you hit enemies, level up your stats, assign skill points, optimize your loadout, and perform special techniques, all the while navigating levels and proceeding through routes unique to each character's place in the story. Both games are great, but Return of the King features additional characters, more equipment slots and modifiers for weapons, more skills to unlock and build your characters with, a Ranger's Hollow for carrying and transferring items over to other characters and playthroughs, and runes for slotting into your weapons and armor for additional modifiers. If you have to choose between either of them, I wholeheartedly recommend Return of the King, but Two Towers is still a lot of fun. Outside of perhaps War in the North, I'm honestly stunned that this kind of Lord of the Rings game has not been attempted again. I would say that I'd love to see a high-budget version of this game at some point, but again, I have to remind myself that it is most likely because of the smaller scale of the Game Boy Advance that we were able to receive these games at all, so I consider myself thankful. If you'll indulge me in another anime-based game, the RPG Fullmetal Alchemist Stray Rondo and its sequel were only released in Japan, but their battle system is perhaps one of the coolest methods of adapting the show's alchemy into a video game that I've ever seen. While being dictated by an ATB system similar to Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy, you can combine various elements, all color-coded to signal specific outcomes, to discover and register new attacks, which is an excellent way of placing you in the shoes of an alchemist throughout the game. And there are many attacks for you to learn over the course of the game. It's not amazing or anything, but the battle system alone consistently impressed me. I don't know, man, there are so many anime-licensed games I could mention here. One Piece had an action platformer also developed by Dimps, and an RPG. Naruto had multiple games, though I don't have anything nice to say about the Ninja Council series at all, and lest we forget the torrential downpour of Yu-Gi-Oh! Games that released for this thing, none of which I have ever played. Instead, though, I'm going to give you a break and talk about some other games for a bit. Technically, this next game is an RPG, but you wouldn't anticipate it being that at a glance. This is Mario Golf Advance Tour. Yeah, I'm not kidding. I love myself a good golf game. Lately, I've been playing the hell out of Hot Shots Golf World Invitational on PS3, and I love Ribbit King, Mario Golf, Monkey Golf, and Golf with Your Friends. But combining RPG elements with a golf game just seems strange to me. Well, this is actually a follow-up to Camelot's Game Boy Color version of Mario Golf, meant to accompany the console version, and as we've established, they have a long history with RPGs through Shining Force and Golden Sun, so combining these two disparate genres ends up making for a surprisingly addictive experience. They did the same thing with Mario Tennis on GBA as well, in case you're more into those games. Here's another unorthodox fusion of genres, this time developed by WayForward, Sigma Star Saga. I discussed this game already in my Shantae retrospective in reference to Matt Bozon's directorial style, and WayForward taking any opportunity to create something original in the 2000s, but essentially, most of the game takes place in an RPG overworld, but whenever you encounter a random battle or you need to go somewhere, the game turns into Gradius, and this is how you level up. I'm not kidding. You can also find various different weapon parts and you can mix and match to your liking. The game is awesome, and an emulated version was very recently made available on modern platforms too. WayForward developed many licensed games for the GBA, including Godzilla Domination, an adaptation of the GameCube game Destroy All Monsters Melee, but it was rare that they would be able to develop an original project for the system like this one. An RPG I fell completely head over heels for when making this video is Riviera: The Promised Land. And I hope someone out there watching right now is delighted to hear that this game reached me. This game was first released on the WonderSwan Color in 2002, but it didn't make its way over here until 2005 with its Game Boy Advance port, featuring a small amount of voice acting, significantly better music and overall sound. Seriously, this game's soundtrack is phenomenal, and most importantly, new and exceptionally moe artwork provided by Sunaho Tobe. As an amnesiac Grim Angel, you battle other angels alongside the girls you meet along the way, and I feel this game is carried firmly by the choices you make and the adorable interactions with these characters, and the game's tense, strategic, and intentionally restrictive battle system. In any given battle, you can only choose 4 items from your inventory, and in order to improve your character's stats, you have to train that item up to a certain level by using it over and over. Eventually, you'll learn a new overdrive ability with that item, and this doesn't just happen with weapons. This can happen with eggs if you want to cook healing items for everyone. It can happen with armor and accessories in case you want to learn buffing abilities, etc. Also, dungeon exploration will present you with a set amount of enemies. So if you ever want to take some time to level your items, you can go into the practice range. You'll retain all of the experience you gain with each item and your characters without degrading any of your items. Oh yeah, that's the other thing. You have to be wise with the weapons you choose to hold on to, because you can only have so many at a time in your inventory, and if you use them enough times, in accordance with the number of uses they have displayed, they will eventually shatter and be removed from your inventory. The good news is that multiple characters can use the same weapons and items depending on how you have your party configured. But on the other hand, that means the items will degrade faster, so you have to take that into consideration if you plan on doing that. The better you do in a battle, the more points you'll receive to interact with things in the dungeon you're in. It's very much like a streamlined point-and-click adventure game, and doing this will reward you with additional character moments, items, battles, and more. Overall, I found the game to be dangerously addictive. Its unique yet easy to understand battle system and its cute characters, adding dating sim elements to the game, made it extremely difficult to put down. And I have since been delighted to learn that it is the first in a grander series of games, including Yggdra Union and various PSP and DS games, so I have plenty more to dig into beyond this game. In regards to RPGs, I was quite selective about which ones I spent most of my time on while recording, so I had to pass up on some other recommendations. Tactics Advance is probably my most egregious exclusion, but I still haven't finished the PS1 game, and I wanted to get through that first. But hey, like I said, having too many games to play is a good problem to have. Outside of that genre, there are still so many games to discover, and I've had a difficult time narrowing things down. Not a lot of people know this, but Rhythm Heaven actually began life on the Game Boy Advance. I finally played it in anticipation for this video, and it's just as good as the rest of the series. I adored this game. Some of the minigames in this one ended up being highlights for me across the entire series. It helped that my Japanese was good enough that I understood what the game was asking of me in both the text and audio cues. For a while, it's only been playable in Japanese, but I've been made aware that a full English patch exists for it if you'd like to check it out. Other games I wanted to play more extensively, but I just didn't have enough time to play everything I had an interest in. As is the case with all of these console retrospectives. Scourge Hive heavily reminded me of Metroid Fusion with its real-time infection mechanic as you explore a space station, and I thought it was awesome. Drill Dozer was developed by Game Freak, and along with its gorgeous sprite work and animation, it managed to intuitively and intelligently make the simple act of drilling through debris immensely satisfying as you explore. Kuru Kuru Kururin's simple core concept of navigating your constantly rotating helicopter through mazes is deceptively challenging and enjoyable. The game feels absolutely timeless as a result. I'm shocked it didn't receive a North American release until the Wii U Virtual Console. And you might have thought Starfy got his start on the DS, but that was actually the 5th game in the series. Starfy 1 through 3 were released in Japan on the GBA, and although you can enjoy its underwater exploration-driven levels entirely without reading any of the text, I found a lot of the text to be entertaining, like when Kyotosuke here reunites with the love of his life, or when I met this group of bacteria that are so hungry they can barely form sentences. Needless to say, I placed myself under a lot of pressure with my choices for this video. That's why, before we move on, I wanted to save a certain hidden gem for last, as it happens to be one of my favorite games on the system altogether. It's an anime-licensed action platformer developed by Treasure, but it's one that I feel everyone should play, due in large part to Treasure making it, one that is an effective introduction to the source material, and therefore, one I don't think you need any knowledge of the author's work to enjoy. Astro Boy Omega Factor. Bearing the look and feel of the 2003 anime adaptation, I feel the game does so much to honor both the spirit of the original story and Osamu Tezuka's larger body of work. Each level segment can either be a typical side-scrolling beat-em-up with light exploration, a horizontal shooting segment, or a boss fight, and all of them take advantage of Astro's abilities for the sake of solid gameplay. Astro's jet boots can allow him to dash around, he's got his finger laser, he can punch and kick things, and his super moves, which regenerate as you deal damage, let you use either his arm cannon or machine guns for huge damage on a single target, or to cover a wide radius around you respectively. The other thing that makes this game so fantastic, however, is its clever use of Tezuka's star system. Basically, in all of his manga, Tezuka treated each of his characters as actors that would slip into new roles as if they were participating in various stage plays. You can find all of these characters throughout the game, both from the Astro Boy canon and far outside of it, and upon finding each of them, you will be rewarded with a skill point that you can assign to Astro's various abilities. So you are encouraged to find and rescue as many of them as possible, both through the main progression of the story, and through finding secrets. Furthermore, the game takes you through to the battle with Pluto, who is being controlled by Sharaku from Tezuka's manga The Three-Eyed One, only for Astro to die and be brought back to the beginning of the game by the immortal Phoenix from the titular manga, Tezuka's life work, and the manga that remained incomplete after he passed away. Which is a fitting way to incorporate Phoenix into the game. With Astro's knowledge of where things are headed, he can travel between areas to find more characters, alter the course of history, and eventually stop Sharaku from using the Death Mask to destroy everything. Most Western players are not going to have any idea who this kid is, but the concept behind his character is that he has a big bandage on his forehead, and when it is removed, Sharaku completely changes personalities as the big third eyeball on his head is revealed. So most Japanese players who knew of the manga probably saw that he was the main villain, and that he lacked a bandage, and had a good laugh. And what's more, in a post-credits scene, after all is said and done, there's a scene where a woman puts a bandage over his forehead, and he becomes docile once again. I'm only explaining this because although I said the game can be enjoyed without greater knowledge of Tezuka's work, there is so much detail in its utilization of his characters that it becomes an even more enjoyable game when you have that knowledge. That being said, it still does adapt story beats from the manga into this time-traveling tribute to Osamu Tezuka, and that also means giving closure to Dr. Tenma's story arc if you know where to look. In spite of how much of a spectacle the storyline is in this game, and how it gives way to all of these characters coming together, the primary message of Astro Boy is still intact here, as wonderfully summarized by a reformed Dr. Tenma in the game's true ending. In addition to the game being absolutely fantastic, it is a faithful adaptation of the spirit of Tezuka's story. It is a perfect marriage of both Treasure's action games and Tezuka's manga. If this game serves as someone's gateway to Tezuka's manga, or perhaps even the stellar 2003 anime it is based on, then I can passionately recommend it to anyone who has any interest in a good action game and a good story. Provided they're watching the original Japanese version of the 2003 series, of course, but that's a story for another day. I will also warn you, this game is very hard, and I was unable to beat it when I was a kid. But in making this video, I 100% completed it in a single sitting. It took me 6 hours, and I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. When I talk about everyone having that one obscure game that they obsessed over, this game was mine, and it, as well as Sin and Punishment, introduced me to Treasure's vast catalog of incredible action games. The best part? The game released on the same day in North America as Sonic Team's Astro Boy game on PS2, which was a 3D action-adventure game that ended up being vastly inferior to the more affordable 2D game on the Game Boy Advance. Once again, scope is not nearly as important as tight execution. Man, do I ever love this game. The Nintendo DS released in 2004, and while it was intended to be a third pillar of Nintendo's hardware lineup, it eventually proved successful enough for it to succeed the Game Boy Advance. Despite this, the Game Boy Advance kept receiving games until 2008. The last first-party game to be published for the system was Final Fantasy VI Advance, which was released in Japan on November 30th, 2006, and in North America on February 5th, 2007. The final game released in PAL regions for the system was The Legend of Spyro: The Eternal Night, released on November 2nd, 2007. The final officially licensed game ever released for the Game Boy Advance was the English localization of Samurai Deeper Kyo, which was bundled with an English DVD box set of the series and released in North America on February 12th, 2008. The system was discontinued in North America that year, and globally by 2010. It stayed on the market as long as it did simply because it was hugely successful. It didn't face low adoption like the GameCube, or a change in the industry like the Wii, or fierce competition or hardware challenges like the Dreamcast or Saturn respectively. Like the PlayStation 2, it lived and died on its own terms. More than anything though, I think the success the Game Boy Advance and its best games were met with is a testament to just how misguided the industry feels today, as budgets rapidly balloon in size and the scope of console games increase. Nintendo, at the very least, has continued to develop games of varying scopes and prices them accordingly, and they perform extremely well in their own regard. Rhythm Heaven Groove, a new entry in a series that began on Game Boy Advance, crushed it at retail in Japan, selling almost 400,000 units physically, and that's just physical sales. Meanwhile, a game like Hi-Fi Rush was developed on a smaller scale and was priced accordingly, saw modest success by attracting 3 million players across digital sales and Xbox Game Pass, and Microsoft shut down Tango Gameworks in response. Thankfully, Tango was salvaged in the aftermath of one of Microsoft's many firing sprees, but the truth is obvious as I'm basically reiterating my point at the beginning of this video. Companies want to invest primarily in huge games that appeal to as many people as possible. I think we are at a turning point right now for the games industry as we know it, and I can only hope that more publishers come to understand how much of a financial and artistic impact can be felt in games developed on any scale, especially smaller ones. Having a strong idea and being able to execute it is at the core of any truly great video game, as vastly successful indie games have been able to demonstrate. Those games being inspired by a lot of the games I talk about on my channel. Rather than just throwing all of their money at one idea with a broad appeal, I feel like it is far better for the sake of this medium for publishers to divide things up, like Nintendo is doing. That way we get more variety and creativity, the very things major publishers used to take a chance on. And publishers can actually expect reasonable returns on games they funded for much smaller budgets. This brings me to my final game. It told a profound, thematically rich, gut-wrenching story, it built an ingenious and constantly evolving combat system, and most importantly, it was developed for the Game Boy Advance after its creator, Shigesato Itoi, realized that it didn't need to be developed on such a massive scale. That game is Mother 3. Famously, Mother 3 was originally going to be released on the Nintendo 64 disk drive, but plans for this fell through after the 64 disk drive's commercial failure. Instead, it was developed with the intent of releasing on a cartridge, but it was taking so long to come together that with the impending release of the GameCube, the game was eventually cancelled. In the aftermath, Itoi wondered how he could tell his story. It wouldn't be until Miyamoto proposed the idea of a GBA version to him that he would reconsider. Miyamoto reportedly thought that they could pull it off with pixel art, upon which Itoi had a significant change of heart. In a sentiment that I heavily relate to, Itoi realized that he had been trying so hard to ensure everything he created was epic and grandiose, as if he were creating his magnum opus each time, when instead, he realized he could tell his story on a smaller scale, with the game still resonating deeply. And when it comes to Mother 3, boy did it ever resonate. Mother 3 is simply put one of the best games I have ever played. In addition to building on the rolling health combat of Earthbound, its rhythm-based combat allows players to connect with the soundtrack as it comes, developing a new skill alongside sharp decision-making. Its parody of the genre is weaved earnestly into its heartfelt storytelling. and its chapter-based structure allows for its thematically layered narrative to unravel over the course of multiple years. It is a tale of grief, how it affects different people, and how unwilling some are to accept what is lost. It is a tale of corruption. While life changes quickly and many people are quick to accept a totalitarian, capitalist invasion of their quiet home, those that know true suffering, like Lucas, are able to see through it all and move forward. Most importantly, though, like the other games in the series, it is an affectionate tale of love. Even sonically, Mother 3 pulls through, despite the aforementioned limitations of the Game Boy Advance's hardware. It features a massive, incredible soundtrack, one sprawling with leitmotif, diversity, emotion, and clarity, and it feels like an utter miracle on this console, to the point where the door opening sequence in Chapter 2 pushes the GBA to its absolute limits, according to composer Shogo Sakai. And above all else, the decision to use pixel art over the game's original three-dimensional focus made it feel visually in line with the other games in the series. It just had to be this way, and the Game Boy Advance is the reason we received this game at all. There's so much I could say about this game here, but I have a video on the Mother series you can watch if you'd like. What I intend to do by showcasing Mother 3 here is to once again reaffirm that scope is never most important when creating any art. There is nothing wrong with a work of art having a vast scope, so long as you are able to fulfill your vision adequately. There are plenty of examples of that in game design. What's most important is execution. As an art, I feel the simplest of illustrations can resonate just as much as something detailed and complex, so long as it holds meaning to both the artist and the viewer. Art deserves the right to be created on varying scopes. It deserves to appeal to whomever wants to seek it out. It deserves to be given a chance to exist. No matter how big or small the project seems, great execution will always matter most of all. And in a time when a low-budget horror film can make back almost 500 times its initial budget, I think the games industry can learn a lot from taking a chance on smaller works, just as it did when it was establishing itself in the late 20th century. Things will never be what they used to be, of course, but I know in my heart that they can get better. The Game Boy Advance is an example of what can happen when art of any shape, appearance, or size is given a chance. I've been Liam Triforce. Thanks for watching.